Welcome to the Expat Edge with Marcus and Matt, where we answer your questions about becoming an expat to help you thrive abroad.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Expat Edge. Today we're going to talk about the number one difficulty for expat families. Marcus, I think more than anyone else I know, you're probably the biggest expert on this because anyone else I know had a lot of help with this situation when they were expats. And the biggest difficulty is definitely schooling if you have kids and you're living abroad. So if you're an expat and you're a senior level employee, usually your company will you either pay for or organize schooling for your children in whatever country you're going to. If you are not an expat and you were just showing up and doing your own thing, running your own business like you did, Marcus, obviously the situation is very different and there are lots of concerns or potential issues to navigate. So maybe Marcus, I'll kind of hand it over to you and you can kind of share maybe just in a few words what experience you've got and maybe some guidance for our viewers.
I think I've heard this quite a few times, just among expats or among people, not even among expats, but among people who express a desire to go abroad with their families. Mm-hmm. It's the fear of the unknown. They don't know what they will do with schooling. They don't know anything about homeschooling. They don't know how good the schools are in different countries. I mean, you can spend hours and hours and hours researching schools, in different countries and still not really have a good idea of where your kids will be spending all day, Right. And so it's just really, really difficult to, especially outside the country. And that's probably why, employers will just say, okay, we'll pay for your kids to go to this really good international school or private school, because then, it will attract obviously good talent to, top executives and things like that. So,
well, one thing you didn't mention is language barrier, right? So if you're going on your own and you've got to pay for school or use the public system that exists in just about every country, you usually have to know the local language to really go to the public schools. So that's obviously a big concern, right?
Right. So that's a whole separate issue. The language issue, I think for the most part, people who want to go to a different country, they're thinking, okay, where can my kids study in English or whatever your native language is or whatever the language is that they already know. So we'll leave the kind of the learning the new language to go to school for a little bit later. But so I've had experience with this in Russia. We've done a lot of research for Turkey, and then now we're in Germany. It didn't really, it's interesting because when we were in Russia, as soon as your kid is born, I know Russians are very, very oriented towards their child's education. They plan years and years in advance. And if it's an international school, even before they're born, if they could get their kid on the list, they would, because these international schools, probably not now, but before, certainly before COVID, they had huge lists to these international schools and things like that. So, and when my kids were born, or when they were very young, Russians would, other Russian friends or where we lived, they would say, well, where are your kids going to go to school? And I'm like, I'll worry about that later. But you really have to plan ahead of time, and you can't. We called all these schools in Moscow, and we basically made spreadsheets and looked at reviews in the expat forums, and we spent a lot of time doing that, and we visited a few, but it came down to really we ended up going to a private school, but we went to the German school, and now we're in Germany, a similar school. So that transition was easier, but some of those private schools are not cheap. If your employer is not paying for your kids' education, you have to really consider that. Do you have the budget to send your kids to a private school, an international school where you're going to be going? And some of the reviews that we read weren't very indicative of the actual atmosphere of the school and what our kids would be going through, because it was when you're going abroad and there's lots of different foreigners going to that international school, there's all types of people. Like in Moscow, there was all types of parents from Czech Republic, Poland, Germany, Italy. I mean, all
Right.
over, and then obviously Russians. So you're not getting a review from someone, a like-minded person. Typically, it could be a European mindset or a specific mindset that you won't take into account until
Right.
you actually have the experience. Like for one family, this is a major priority, and for you, maybe it's not. And you see that review and you're like, oh no, I'm so worried about this. So, and then we did a ton of research. We're thinking, okay, maybe we could go to Turkey for a few years, and because we visited Turkey so many times on vacation, and we enjoy the atmosphere there.
Mm-hmm.
But when we got to actually, we even visited schools, we compared pricing and things like that. But when for us, Turkish was very, very difficult to learn, or is difficult to learn in a few years to the level where you should learn a language.
Right.
And some of the private schools, by law, they have to teach half of the curriculum in Turkish.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a deal breaker. It's like, well, we're not going to be in Turkey for several years, so that's not going to work for us. So those are just some of the issues. You can't really make a good, and then you get to a country thinking, okay, this is a good fit, and then you're like, well, we don't like the school, we're going to switch to another. You just have to plan for the budget if you're not going to homeschool your kids.
Right. Well, I mean, in most countries, you can, go to a public school, but again, without the language, that makes it a very difficult, especially, the older your kids are, the harder. If we're talking about kindergarten or first grade, I'm sure they'll manage in whatever language, at that age, and they'll pick up another language quite quickly. But if your kids are teenagers,
yes,
it's going to be absolutely brutal, I imagine, trying to have them start from scratch.
That's a very good point. Like up to this point, I was mostly talking about, going to a school that, your kids know, like the language of. But when we get into that realm of going to a public school, Germany honestly does a very good job of this, because they have a lot of resources. They give you resources. They give the kids resources to learn German quickly. It's like integrate quickly. Mm-hmm. And within, a year to 2 years, your kid, depending on the age, will know German to a very good level where they're comfortable.
I doubt that's the case in Czech Republic, for example.
I don't know how that would be. I don't think it was the case in Turkey. We didn't even consider some of the public schools, although they were very highly spoken of.
Yeah.
But it's just, if you're going to a place for a short period of time, I would say less than 5 years, are you really going to learn? And then maybe two things. Are you going for less than 5 years, and will you use that language later or not? Those are probably the two most important questions.
Yeah.
If you will use that language somehow, maybe a distant relative, family member, you want to get back into the language, reconnect with heritage, then it might make sense. But if none of those are the case, then I don't think it's worth it.
Yeah. Well, and just one last point we should make. When you were researching schools, I more or less know the prices, what they were in Russia for the different levels of international schools. And there clearly are different levels. Usually you have like some private school that's really Russian run, but with, they try to do the international curriculum. That'll be, I don't know, let's say $10,000 or so per year. And it's a good education, but $10,000 a year. And when you get up to like the Anglo-American school, which most countries have for the diplomats from the English-speaking countries, that usually runs $30,000 a year if you can get a spot. Sometimes more.
Yeah,
I heard in Singapore it's close to 50,000. So it's all over the place. And if you have multiple kids, it can be expensive very fast.
Yeah, so we looked specifically when we were looking in Moscow, private Russian schools, also very well rated. The one we were looking at was 450,000 rubles a year, so it was okay, right? It was doable. What's that? I don't know, 6,000 to 8,000 or so a year. Yeah. So it was less than 10,000 a year. And the international schools will be double that, typically, or even more.
Yeah.
And then in Turkey, we looked in Alanya. They were like 4,000 to 8,000 a year. Also very manageable. But again, the caveat there was some of the curriculum will be in Turkish. So I mean, anything that is, if you have 3 kids and you're spending, at the German school in Moscow, you're spending like $8,000 a year for 2 kids, and we had a 3rd kid, and we were like, well, we probably wouldn't be able to afford that. So really you have to plan and budget and understand, like, okay, can you really, if you can't afford it, can you really homeschool? Right. I guess you could get a bunch of tutors, but I'm not sure how that's going to work out.
Yeah. I mean, at some point, it's obviously the only cheap option you have is your kids learning the local language, and then it's going to be free in almost every country, right? But that's depending on ages, that's either a relatively difficult hill to climb or a ginormous mountain if you've got a teenager, right?
Right, and you have to factor in. You have to factor in the resources that school, that district or whatever, gives to foreigners as well. Again, in Germany, if your kids are 10 or younger, it's manageable. Yeah, you could send your kids to a public school, but if those resources aren't there, I wouldn't probably even start after 8 or so with a kid. 8 and younger is probably the cutoff for me, in my experience. Right.
So that's kind of our thoughts on the biggest difficulty for families. Again, this is a topic that Nomad Capitalist brings up is, people always want to work with me, and then, they end up saying no for family reasons. But look, if you don't have a high-paying job, it can be quite difficult to cover that. So just something to keep in mind. Let us know what your experience is. If you've tried to or are considering living abroad with a family, let us know in the comments. We'd be happy to answer your questions. We'll see you in another video.
This was the Expat Edge with Matt and Marcus. We hope you enjoyed the video. Visit theexpatedge.com for even more content that will help you thrive abroad. You can submit your ideas for video topics and sign up for free at theexpatedge.com. See you there.